Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Power, Senior Vice President of Corporate Services at OTC Markets Group. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for this OTC Markets educational webinar, Understanding the Importance of Blue Sky Laws in the U.S. Market. Before we begin the webinar, just a few housekeeping items. All participants will be on mute. The presentation will last about 20 minutes, after which there will be a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A session. For those of you asking questions, we ask that you type them into the Q&A box located on your screen. We'll answer as many questions as possible with the time remaining. If we can't get to your question, we'll reach out directly to you after the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and a link will be emailed to all registrants, along with a copy of the presentation. And a copy of this webinar will also be archived at the OTC Markets website. So on the next slide, we are going to talk about the purpose of this webinar is to understand what are blue sky exemptions and why are they important for trading in the US. We're pleased to have two panelists join us today. Tom Dooley, Senior Vice President, Community Bank Professional at D.A. Davidson. D.A. Davidson is a U.S.-based leading full-service brokerage firm that serves clients nationwide with expertise in wealth management, capital markets, investment banking, and trust and asset management strategies. Tom has been serving clients in the financial services industry since the mid-'80s. With roots as an equity trader, Tom developed an interest in trading shares of community banks, a specialty that he continues to this day. Gareth Colglazer, Senior Vice President of Issuer Compliance, Issuer and Information Services at OTC Markets Group, has worked specifically on blue sky compliance-related issues for OTC Markets Group over the past several years. Tom and Gareth, thanks very much for joining us today on the webinar.
You.
Okay, so I will kick it off. The question is, what is blue sky? What does the term blue sky mean? If you look at the origin of the term blue sky, it's said to have originated in the early 1900s, gaining widespread use when a Kansas Supreme Court justice declared his desire to protect investors from speculative ventures that had no more basis than so many feet of blue sky. From a general overview, companies that trade on OTC markets must be compliant with the blue sky laws in each U.S. state or territory in order for brokers to recommend their stock to investors in that state or territory. Gareth, let's start with you. Many companies don't fully understand the U.S. blue sky laws and the role that these laws play in the equities markets. Can you talk a bit about what is blue sky from your perspective and why is it important?
Sure, no problem. So I think that's kind of natural. A lot of companies may not consider or think about blue sky because it's kind of operating in the background. And it's sort of a specific issue in our markets, and we can get into why, but quite simply, blue sky is the collection of state securities laws. It regulates the offer and sale of securities at a state level. And it really comes into play when you're talking about the role of investment professionals recommending securities. And we can get into why that is. But just know that it is state law that regulates the offer and sale of securities in a given state. And so I think the large reason why issuers sort of don't think about this right away, or maybe it's a secondary concern as far as they're thinking about the trading markets for their securities, is because there are a lot of exemptions under these laws that actually support sort of normal market activity. The type of sort of retail activity where self-directed investors are purchasing and selling securities of their own volition. There are exemptions in most states that allow for this type of activity where investors know they want to buy a particular security. They go into their electronic brokerage account and they just punch in an order and that order gets filled. Where we talk about blue sky with respect to secondary trading is when you actually have investors who have a working relationship with an investment professional, be it a registered representative or an investment advisor, or perhaps their brokerage account is managed by one of those investment professionals. That's where blue sky comes into play. And when they cannot rely on unsolicited exemptions to facilitate their orders and transactions, that's where other exemptions may come into play.
So Gareth, that's really focused on when brokers recommend to retail and non-accredited investors, and they're recommending, as the slide says, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't draw that distinction on accredited. It's mostly the manner of sale, and Tom can get into this about solicitation. I know that there's been a lot of developments as far as what constitutes solicitation these days. But just know that when there's that type of relationship and that type of nature of sale where an investment professional may or may not be recommending or soliciting advice, that's where other exemptions come into play. And that's kind of where we provide services that allow companies to understand their compliance. And that's the background here.
Gareth, how do companies that trade on OTC markets, how do they know, how can they see what states they are blue sky compliant in? I know we'll talk a bit about that later when we show some of the states involved, but how would they know that? How would they know to look for that?
Sure. So obviously, we offer our blue sky monitoring service. It's a part of the suite of services that comes with our OTCQX offering. Other issuers on our QB market or pink market can subscribe to it if they wish, and we'll have more information later on that. But what the service provides is just a daily output of simply a compliance status of yes, the company is compliant with an exemption in this state, or no, the company, based on our analysis, does not have a secondary trading exemption available to it in a given state. So we provide that for every state, for every issuer, every day. And that service is accessible through our OTCIQ portal.
Thanks, Gareth. Talk a bit about our blue sky data product and how that serves in monitoring blue sky exemption.
Sure. So at the same time, we offer that data to issuers to understand their own compliance and perhaps some barriers to secondary market liquidity. We offer the same service to the brokerage community as well. So it helps broker dealers, with their own internal compliance processes, so that they know that when they are receiving orders and orders are entered into their order management system that may be solicited transactions, that they can actually understand what is okay in certain states. And the way that works is when they are dealing with an investor in a particular state, they need to make sure that that security is essentially blue skied or compliant in the state in which that investor resides. So that's how else we make make this data available to other market participants.
Got it. Okay. So let's talk about the types of exemptions. There's a bullet point there. OTCQX, OTCQB, foreign issuer exemption, manual exemption, sort of the different kinds of ways that companies can be under the blue sky compliance umbrella with these exemptions. Could you talk about that a bit and how it's different for companies?
So every state is different, obviously, and there have been attempts to sort of standardize these laws across several states, but not every state has adopted those sort of model acts that would standardize their laws. So these are some of the common exemptions out there. So obviously our OTCQX and OTCQB markets, which we'll touch on later, are recognized by a number of states for the purposes of secondary trading. And those exemptions have other eligibility requirements, but being on QX and QB does allow them to meet those exemptions. There are exemptions for foreign issuers if they are, say, on a particular exchange abroad, or if they meet certain sort of size and seasoning requirements. There are exemptions for how a company makes disclosure available. So if a company, is subject to Exchange Act reporting requirements, they file Qs and Ks with the SEC. That there's exemptions for that, and these are just some of the common ones that we see across several jurisdictions.
Got it. Okay, so it's clearly very important for companies to look at being blue sky exempt in as many jurisdictions as possible, particularly from a trading perspective and that kind of thing. So we'll go to the next slide. And Tom, it's a good segue into you. From a blue sky perspective, what does that mean in the real world? How are stocks that you see impacted in your experience when they're not compliant in a given state?
Well, obviously, we can't solicit business in that state, and then so that state is, you just can't do it. So, and the interesting thing, you talk about solicitation. There's a definition for solicitation, but the way the brokerage industry has gone over the past, several years, there's almost no such thing as an unsolicited trade. Maybe by definition, but in practice, no. And so it's really not an exemption that a brokerage firm is really going to rely on. And so if, in many cases, if it's not blue sky, you're not able to run that trade. You're not able to solicit business in that name or in that jurisdiction.
Got it.
So it's getting worse.
Yeah, understood. Tom, how do you and other third parties, how do you access information on a company's blue sky, a company that's on OTC markets, OTCQX or OTCQB? How do you know when they're, what states are compliant? How do you access that information?
So we use Blue Sky Data Corp, and that feeds somehow into our computer, and so it's on our order entry system. If something is not blue sky, you get a flag, but you really don't want to wait that long. You want to find out in advance, obviously. So we check with Blue Sky Data Corp, and if it's if it only has a few states in there, we generally just have to move on. There's no it's not worth it.
Tom, so looking at the universe of OTC markets, talk about the importance from your perspective if a company is on the premier tier OTCQX or OTCQB versus trading on OTC Pink, Current, or Expert Market from a blue sky perspective.
We're in Ohio, we're in the Midwest. And so most of the states that are QX or QB that we would do business in are, have an exemption through the QX or QB. And so if we pull up, say, on the in our quote system, and it says that the stock is listed in QX or QB, that's probably good enough to start to go forward. If it's we're going to assume in our markets that thing is blue sky eligible. Now we'll verify that later, but when we're looking around, that's where we'd start. If it's OTC Pink or if it's Expert Market, our assumption is it's not blue sky anywhere. We've got to pause and then go through and do our research.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's we have a list here on the slide of the states that have blue sky exemption recognition on our premier tiers. Let's go to the next slide and look at an actual map. Gareth, maybe you could talk about the fact that there are 37 states for OTCQX that have blue sky compliance manual recognition, and then the 33 states through OTCQB. Can you talk about OTC Markets efforts and progress in this, and your comments on that?
Sure. So beginning in, it was almost 6 years ago, 2016, we started reaching out to individual states and the collection of, there's a central organization called the North American Securities Administrators. It's sort of a leadership group for these state securities regulators. about recognition of our OTCQX and OTCQB markets. And this slide highlights the progress we've made to date, but we are continuing to talk with every state out there about their secondary trading landscape and recognition of these markets. You know, through the course of these 6 years, we've just tried to highlight the, you know, eligibility requirements and disclosure requirements of our markets in this effort to get them to sort of recognize that these two markets, you know, have high disclosure requirements, and there's a robust set of information out there available to investors such that you know, they should consider this. And so this 37 states that recognize QX, the 33 that recognize QB, you know, are an indication of where we've come. And I think that bottom bullet point there, Bob, on this slide is worth mentioning as well. Just because those are the states that have recognized these markets to date does not mean that those are the only states that we see our issuers usually compliant in. It's usually higher than that. And there are some states here that are not filled in green where, you know, our process, our compliance process, by requiring, you know, sort of robust disclosure, does allow for compliance in other states here. So that median QX compliance in 43 states kind of tells the story that I think is important to take away here, that we see issuers compliant in much more than just the 37 that recognize QX and the 33 that recognize QB.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Our team works with OTC QX and OTC QB companies, obviously, every day, and quite often the topic comes up and we look at that and we see the median number of 43. Quite often they're in that ballpark range. So that's a good point. Tom, talk about when you talk to public companies and I know that you've discussed Blue Sky with them, and you show them a map like this with the, you know, even the minimum for OTCQX representing 37 states or 190 million people. How do companies react to that, and what's the feedback you get in you know, out there in the field?
Well, I guess I'll back up a little bit. When we first explained to them that they're not compliant in some states, there's, you know, they're shocked. They really don't understand a lot of them what you know, what Blue Sky is. And they're kind of in denial. You know, they speak to their attorney a little bit, and the attorney thinks he can get them Blue Sky, and that rarely works. So after they go through this process, you know, there is some concern. But the map, you know, this is where you're Blue Sky, right? So I guess the bigger concern that we kind of highlight and talk about is if you're Blue Sky in 6 states, all right, and that's it. And you know, you are not, your stock cannot be solicited in, you know, to, I don't know, you know, a couple 100 million people or 100 million people. This large percentage population cannot buy your stock. You can't solicit an order there. If I can't solicit an order, we're probably not going to inventory that stock, and so there's not a commitment of cap over that. And I think the board has a hard time with you know, their obligations to enhance shareholder value if only a small percentage of, you know, the population can purchase the stock. And so then they start to process it, and then it kind of makes sense. So the map is if you know, if they don't understand this and that, when they see the map, it resonates. It's pretty clear.
Yeah. And again, so you know, those watching this may see a state that you're in, and we would advise, like, if you don't see that there's Blue Sky compliance to the point that that's the minimum that we're showing, quite often there are more states that cover an individual stock, as Gareth pointed out. So, you know, if you don't see your company in a state that you're located in, we would recommend that you go to otciq.com and look at your Blue Sky presence there as it's specific to your company. And then, you know, we can provide a resource. That does lead to another question. Maybe this one's for Gareth. Gareth, what do we do when companies go to us and say, hey, look, I'd love to be compliant in a given state? Can, you know, what kind of guidance do we give on that?
Yeah, so non-compliance, you know, can be for a number of reasons. Perhaps that jurisdiction just has sort of a bare landscape as far as secondary trading exemptions go. And so you're looking at other alternatives. The state may have a method for filing certain information with it, and actually having it reviewed by an examiner there and going through a compliance process, and it's a registration process essentially, where you submit a bunch of paperwork to the state, and they review it and clear you for a year is typically the window there. But there may be just exemptions within that state where your company, is going to meet the requirements of an exemption in a matter of time, or as the company matures and develops more assets. It just depends on the given state, and there can be other sort of ways to comply. I know that there are securities manuals out there, and those are worth considering if a company is rounding out its blue sky, and sometimes they can have benefits. But we're happy to examine any specific issue or situation and get back to them with some ideas as far as how to comply in more jurisdictions.
Great. Yeah.
Tom. I'd like to add something to that. So we have some issuers that you pull up the laws in, say, Ohio, and it seems like this issuer would be blue sky eligible in Ohio, and you go through and check all the boxes, and maybe their legal team does, and so you think they should be blue sky in Ohio. From a brokerage firm standpoint, if they don't show up on your list or show up on Blue Sky Data Corp, even though they look like they're blue sky, doesn't matter. It's a very old system, and so just because it looks like you're blue skied, and you may be blue skied, if that issue's not showing up on our list or your list, we can't run the trade. And so that's a tough way to go about gaining eligibility in some of these states.
Right. Thank you, Tom. And yeah, the bottom line is we can be a good focal point for companies to reach out to and provide assistance in all those cases. Okay, let's go to the Q&A part, the next slide. And yeah, thank you, Gareth and Tom, for your insights and your overviews. We're looking at a few questions that have come in. Okay, so the first question that I have is, if a company is not blue sky compliant in a state, does that mean investors cannot buy the stock in that state? Maybe Gareth, would you be able to answer that, or take a stab at that?
Sure. I mean, generally as a principle, it definitely means that investors can't be solicited in that state. Now, blue sky compliance is really a broker dealer concern, but obviously issuers have a stake in understanding where their barriers to having their securities be traded in the secondary markets can occur. So it really depends on how a broker dealer would be managing their internal compliance processes to understand whether they can allow a trade or a potential order to actually go through, or whether that trade has to be busted, as Tom touched on earlier. So like I said at the beginning of this, there are sort of pervasive unsolicited exemptions for sort of normal flow, but as Tom touched on, the solicitation is becoming more and more of a concern, and so it kind of depends on whether that order is being marked as solicited, and whether that broker dealer is comfortable relying on unsolicited exemptions. So it's going to depend on each order's sort of circumstances, but if a company is not considered compliant in that state, and the broker dealer has reason to believe that's the case as well, then most likely that solicited order in that state is not going to be able to go through, so to speak.
Thank you, Gareth. Talk about Blue Sky Data Corp, part of OTC Markets Group, and the important role that Blue Sky Data Corp plays in the whole reaching the different constituents.
So I didn't want to interject earlier when Tom was speaking about Blue Sky Data Corp, but OTC Markets did just recently acquire Blue Sky Data Corp. So Tom, you are now a OTC Markets customer as well. But as I touched on earlier, in addition to providing this information to issuers, we obviously provide it to the brokerage community, and we're doing that before we acquired Blue Sky Data Corp. But now the reach that this data has through our acquisition is much larger. They had a number of they had a number of clients, obviously in their 30 years of history, and those have mostly transitioned over to us. So that is the way that this data makes it out there to run sort of broker-dealer compliance protocols like Tom touched on earlier.
Got it. Okay. Next question. If a company that is trading in the OTC Pink market upgrades to the premium tiers, either OTCQX or OTCQB, do they automatically get the Blue Sky compliance coverage day one in the 33 or the 37 states that we talked about? Gareth, maybe you could address that too.
Like I said, those exemptions that recognize QX and QB, generally speaking, have other eligibility requirements. So sometimes those are seasoning requirements. Sometimes they're asset number requirements. So it can take some time for an issuer to be eligible for those exemptions after joining QX or QB. But in a lot of cases, that's not what's going on. The issuer, as soon as they join, are eligible under these exemptions.
Got it. Okay. Okay, the next question we have from an attendee is, does Blue Sky apply to SMAs, separately managed accounts, wrap accounts?
So
yeah, go ahead, Gary.
My understanding is that it does. Those, the management of those accounts and transactions that occur in reference to those accounts, are essentially you have someone else doing the actual buying and selling for these accounts, and those cannot be unsolicited orders. Tom may have a different understanding.
No, I've seen.
Yeah. And so, Blue Sky is really applicable to those types of accounts.
Got it. Okay. Here's a question. How hard is it for a TSXV stock to be Blue Sky compliant? A company that's listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange venture market. Gareth, maybe you can answer that.
Sure. So there are 2 states that recognize TSX venture for purposes of secondary trading. I can't quite recall what they are offhand, but I believe one is Wisconsin. And the other requirement of that exemption, as I recall, is that the company's been listed or providing information in Canada for at least 180 days. So that's not a very widespread exemption, and only 2 jurisdictions wouldn't support a whole lot of secondary trading activity. But like we said at the beginning, there are other common sets of exemptions, and obviously a TSX venture issuer could consider our QX and QB markets. We have a number of them. We have good active participation with and cross-listing activity between our markets and the Canadian exchanges.
Yeah, that's a very common approach for many TSX venture companies, is to upgrade to the OTC QX or OTC QB market. Okay, let me just. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Again, Gareth, this is Canadian related as well. Talk about a CSE, a Canadian Securities Exchange listed company. And is that any different from TSXV?
When the TSXV and TSX exemptions were created in the early 2000s, CSE was not around. So to my knowledge, CSE is not recognized by any states for similar exemptions. So they would be sort of out of luck, as it were.
Okay. So again, why another very important reason why many CSE companies look to our premium tiers to get into the Blue Sky compliance issue. Yeah, that's about it for the questions. And so with that, I'll wrap up this educational webinar. I thank all the all the attendees that have joined. And if we didn't have a chance to get to your question, we will respond to you over the next day for sure. And Gareth and Tom, thank you both very much for your excellent insights into this really important topic. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Bob.
Okay. Great. Thanks all. Thanks for joining. And we'll be sending a copy of this webinar again to all of you that have registered. And we appreciate your attending this webinar. Thank you.